We are at the end of the 50th anniversary of 1968, which is a really, really important moment in American history, both for developments in the Vietnam War and also for developments in American politics and society. And so because we're on the 50th anniversary, the only 50th anniversary we get, we wanted to do this kind of special class lecture where we're going to look at why 1968 was such a turning point in both the Vietnam War and also in American politics. So 1968, Vietnam, America, and beyond, it's a turning point for the United States, both in terms of Vietnam and also in American politics. Before we kind of get into the substance of this topic, does anybody want to share with us some of the things we discussed when it came to the nature of the Vietnam War? What kind of war was the United States involved in between 1965, 66, and 67? We talked about that last class. Corbin? So the Cold War is what you're saying? So of course it's a Cold War conflict, right? The United States is trying to contain communism, right? This is why the United States is involved in Vietnam. And that went back, America's involvement in this situation went back to the 1950s, really taking over after the French were defeated at the end of the Indochina War in the so-called Battle of Dien Bien Phu, right? Of course, ultimately the United States became involved not because it wanted to colonize Vietnam, but because it believed it was a very important place in the world to contain communism. And this was largely because of the spread of communism in Asia at the time. You had the fall of China to communism under Mao in 1949. You had, of course, the Korean War in 1950. Other events creating tension in the Cold War were things like the Soviet atomic bomb and fears over espionage. So the Cold War very much escalated. So yes, the Vietnam War was about the Cold War and containing communism. But when the United States got involved in the war and we start seeing Americans directly involved in combat, 1965, 1966, 1967, what kind of war was it? What was the war like? What type of policy did the American government create to try to win this war? Julian.
Oh, it was a war of containment, and that it was to contain the spread of communism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a war to contain the spread of communism. But let me ask a more pointed question here. How does the United States expect to win the war in Vietnam? When American boots are on the ground in 1965 and 66, what's the way that they think they're going to win this conflict? Nick?
Show superiority, fight.
Say it again?
Show superiority and fight.
Okay, so a show of American power and might. They very much believed that the technological prowess of the United States could ensure a quick victory, right? I mentioned a factoid that is very kind of stunning to people when they learn this, that the United States actually in the Vietnam War dropped more tons of bombs in the area of Southeast Asia and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia than they did in all theaters of World War II combined, which is an incredible show of force, right? The difference, by the way, is not close in terms of the tonnage in the Vietnam War. You're talking about 7 million tons of bombs, approximately. World War II, you're talking about just under 3 million tons of bombs dropped in that conflict. So it's not even close. So America does feel that they can win this war with an overwhelming show of force, right? What are they seeking? What are they trying to gain? Porfirio.
They want them to sign that treaty.
So they want them to sign a treaty, right? They want them to sign a peace treaty. But how are they going to get the North Vietnamese to do this?
Complete annihilation.
Well, it's not really a war of annihilation, Corbin. It's a war of containment. It's actually highly limited. They want to force the North Vietnamese believe that they're trying to unify their country. That's their goal. This is how they see it. Unify North and South Vietnam, one country, one national identity, right? How do they think? Nick, you're right. An overwhelming show of force, right? What do they think the overwhelming show of force, how is that going to achieve a signature at the peace table? Thomas.
Decolonization of communism, or what was considered communism.
Well, think more about the war. So not so much like, people have mentioned things like the containment of communism, these types of things, but think about the Johnson administration. They're getting involved in this war in 1965. How do they expect to force the North Vietnamese communists to come to the peace table and sign an agreement that says we're okay with South Vietnam not being united with the North? How does the United States think they're going to achieve that? Okay, so what they're trying to find, I'm going to take you here now. What they're trying to find is the breaking point, right? Nick, you're right. Tremendous amount of bombing as well, Porfirio. The United States is trying to use an overwhelming level of force to try to find the enemy's breaking point. In the ground war in Vietnam, the goal is the goal in the ground war to take land and territory, to capture cities and these types of things?
Kill count?
Yeah, the kill count, right? The goal in Vietnam was to basically kill as many of the enemy as is possible, right? It was a war of attrition to try to exact a level of destruction on the enemy, whether through the bombing campaign or through search and destroy operations on the ground, that it would take the war to such a point that the enemy would basically cry uncle and give up. They're looking for their breaking point, right? The United States sort of gradually descends into the war in pursuit of this sort of invisible breaking point, right? And the problems with trying to pursue this sort of unknown line where the enemy will cry uncle and say we want to sign a peace treaty was that American policymakers really never knew where that line was. And the ramifications of that for the war is that the United States simply escalated increasingly, more and more and more, to try to exact greater and greater casualties upon the enemy, right? And this takes you to a point where by 1967, you're witnessing an increasingly unpopular war. In the fall of 1967, there were huge protests against the U.S. war in Vietnam, particularly the Stop the Draft Week protest, which is one of the most famous of all the protest movements during the Vietnam War. So the war became increasingly controversial. You had more and more Americans being drafted into the war. The United States is exacting more and more bombing on areas of South Vietnam and areas of North Vietnam. You have an increasing escalation of force in Vietnam without really any show of peace, really, right? There's no real negotiations on the floor. By 1967, the war is becoming increasingly unpopular. So if you were the Johnson administration, and the military is convinced they can win this war in 1967, they're convinced that they can win this war. If you were the Johnson administration and you see this war becoming increasingly unpopular, you're sort of gradually descending into this conflict, trying to, as you said, Cody, they're trying to exact an increasing amount of death toll on the enemy, the kill count, right? They're trying to bomb the enemy to greater and greater extents so that they might find the enemy's breaking point, and they haven't yet found that. And as a result of this, the war is becoming increasingly unpopular. So if you saw the situation where the Johnson administration still thinks they can win this war, and the war is nonetheless becoming increasingly unpopular, how might you address that if you were the President of the United States? How would you deal with the fact that you have an increasingly unpopular war, but you nonetheless feel you can win? What might you say to the American people? Cody. You tell them you're making progress, and that's exactly what the Johnson administration does. You tell them you're making progress, and this occurs with what's sometimes referred to as the public relations campaign of 1967. The Johnson administration saw this problem with popular support for the war, declining popularity, declining really confidence in the war effort. And as a result of that, they did exactly what Cody said. They went on a public relations campaign. They continued operations like Operation Chaos, which was a CIA and FBI operation to surveil Americans. This, of course, was illegal. They're not telling people about this, but there's upwards of 7,000 secret files being kept on anti-war figures. And probably the most The most controversial of these were, of course, the surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., who came out against the war in 1967. So they're doing things like this secretly to try to undermine opposition to the war. And then publicly, they're doing exactly what you said. They're out there in the fall of 1967, and they're telling the people, we're winning this war. They're emphasizing the kill count. Look at the casualties they've exacted on their enemy. Look at the discrepancy in terms of how successful American soldiers are in the battlefield. Westmoreland suggested that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. General Westmoreland was the commanding general of the American operation in Vietnam. Robert McNamara, though, who is the Secretary of Defense, you see pictured right here, McNamara began to grow critical of the effort. It became realized in 1967 that even though the United States had continually increased the bombing campaign, that infiltration into the South was not stopping. In fact, it was increasing. The bombing campaign, at least when it came to trying to cut off the Vietnamese communist ability to supply the South, was really not working. And McNamara starts criticizing this. He suggests, maybe we should turn the war more over to the Vietnamese. They called this Vietnamisation. Maybe they should turn the war over to the Vietnamese. And the United States might consider beginning to back away from this a little bit. McNamara, the individual who had really masterminded the bombing effort in Vietnam, the head of the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, was now becoming a little bit critical. Now, we talked about Johnson. We said Lyndon Johnson. Some political scientists have called Lyndon Johnson a low-complexity thinker as a president, right? How do you think Johnson would react to that? Thomas? Well, his Secretary of Defense, but yeah, he'd probably fire him, right? Which is basically what he does. He gets him replaced. He has him sent over to the World Bank. His term ends at the beginning of 1968. He replaces McNamara with a new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, who he believes is kind of his guy in Vietnam. And that's because, as we talked about, what it means to be a low-complexity thinker for a political scientist is not necessarily meant to be a terrible criticism. It just means that after he makes a decision, Johnson wants people that are loyal in pursuing the goal. And he sees Robert McNamara as now disloyal. He suggests that he's cracking up, that he can't handle the strain anymore. And McNamara is effectively pushed out of the administration, is replaced by a new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford. Now, the public relations campaign of 1967, which Cody was pointing out, made a lot of sense, right? They think they're winning. America thinks they're winning on numbers in terms of the amount of bombs that are being dropped, in terms of the amount of Viet Cong in the South and North Vietnamese communists coming in from the North. The kill ratios are overwhelming. And so as a result of that, the United States really believes that they're winning. William Westmoreland believes they can win the war. They just need to exact the right amount of pressure on their opponent. But the public relations campaign, as you mentioned, going out there and saying, we're doing better than people might think, and victory is soon going to be ours, right? That was a very significant development. And the reason was because in January of 1968, in January of 1968, 67 actually, is when Khe Sanh begins. In December of 1967, I apologize for that. It actually, the first battles surrounding areas of the Central Highlands began in late 1967. And then in January of 1968, from the 21st to July 9th, 1968, the Battle of Khe Sanh begins. Now, why does this matter? Because we're getting to a major moment in the development of the Vietnam War. Khe Sanh is located right here. It's near the border between North and South Vietnam. This is the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. It was a boundary between North and South Vietnam. And the United States had located Khe Sanh right here. This is like a base. It's not a city. It's a military base. It's got an airstrip. American troops are stationed there. And the idea with Khe Sanh was that you would locate yourself near this point because this is a point of high infiltration. There's lots and lots of communist infiltration at this point. And so Khe Sanh was established to stop infiltration from the north to the south. Well, in January of 1968, shortly before the beginning of what's called the Tet Offensive, Khe Sanh was really under a full assault by the North Vietnamese army. And the battle begins largely because, well, at least from the American perspective, the battle begins because they think that the North Vietnamese are seeking a major victory, that they want to gain a victory like the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, ending the French Indochina War. They want to gain a major victory that will force the Americans and their allies to negotiate with them. This is what American policymakers think. This is another Dien Bien Phu. They're trying to, Dien Bien Phu ended the French Indochina War. It was a battle that lasted over 50 days in which the Vietnamese communists sieged a French base here at Dien Bien Phu, ultimately won a crushing victory, and forced the French to negotiate to end the French Indochina War. American policymakers and the leadership, the military leadership like General Westmoreland, think that this is exactly what the battle at Khe Sanh is going to be. Here is a base, remotely located. It's near infiltration points, near Laos. The North Vietnamese army start attacking this. And they are convinced that the effort here by the North Vietnamese is to stage another Dien Bien Phu. It's actually a diversion. And it's one that American policymakers and military leaders don't really understand at the time. The administration was obsessed with this. Lyndon Johnson had a flat map of Khe Sanh in the White House. They were obsessing over this battle. It is the most bombed battle in the history of history. I think it's in the history of all military history. 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped in a 5 square mile area to protect the fire base at Khe Sanh, to prevent it from being overrun. A tremendous amount of force was dumped into this to try to prevent Khe Sanh from falling because of the idea that there was believed that if it fell, that it would be such a loss, a psychological loss for America, that their ally in the South might be encouraged to negotiate with the North. It's actually a diversion. And it's a diversion for the event that is ultimately known as the Tet Offensive. And it's called the Tet Offensive because Tet was the Lunar New Year. And the Tet Offensive was launched just after the Battle of Khe Sanh really began. All of these little red markings on the map are meant to depict a battle during Khe Sanh in which the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attacked almost every provincial capital in the South. They attacked a myriad of cities, high-profile ones, as well as provincial capitals all across the South. Some of the most significant of these battles are attacks on places like the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And this was the North's real plan. They wanted to divert the United States' attention up here to Khe Sanh to take their attention away from an operation that was planned to launch an offensive across South Vietnam. What's their goal? Their goal is to inspire a general uprising. And what do you think? Now, the North Vietnamese are, of course, communists. Many of their ideas are influenced by other communist revolutionary thinkers. What do you think they thought would happen? What's a general uprising mean, do you think, for the leadership of North Vietnam during this conflict?
More power.
I mean, that's their goal, right? They think that this will be the event that will unite North and South Vietnam. But what do you think they mean? General uprising.
More support.
Okay, so popular support. What they think is going to happen is that as the United States have their attention diverted up here at Khe Sanh, they think launching an attack like this, largely much of it launched by Viet Cong guerrillas, will inspire an upswell of support for nationalism and North Vietnam, for the communist movement. And that every farmer will grab a weapon of any kind and rise up against the American imperialists in their, as they would see it, puppet government, right? That's what they think will happen. That's what they hope will happen. Of course, it actually doesn't happen. They do perpetrate a large-scale general attack throughout the South, but the people's uprising, like you were suggesting, Octavia, doesn't really actually, it never comes to be. It never happens. This was a well-planned out operation too, by the way, and in this sense, the public relations campaign of 1967 in a way had actually deceived the actual policymakers in Washington, D.C. themselves. Members of the intelligence and military apparatus, there were documents that suggested, that were captured, that suggested this was coming, and many of those things were ignored. And it was a very covertly organized campaign. There were Viet Cong guerrillas who entered Saigon wearing ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, our ally in the South, their military uniforms. There were Viet Cong groups that had buried weapons in graveyards and went in and dug them up in the wee hours of the morning and began to undertake this offensive. But in a lot of respects, you could say the United States really should have seen a lot of the warning signs, and they didn't. If you consider the public relations campaign, which Cody, you pointed out, it's very significant. Because when this happens, when the Tet Offensive is launched, it really shocks the American people. Most shocking events were things like the U.S. Embassy in Saigon under attack. 19 Viet Cong guerrillas at 2:45 in the morning broke into the embassy compound, and a shootout in and around the area of the embassy unfolded. All of these events are being covered by the journalists. The news is coming back to the States, and you have the news of embassy employees wearing, a white shirt and tie, having shootouts with Viet Cong guerrillas, right? All 19 of those guerrillas were ultimately killed, and the embassy had some damage, but ultimately they were rooted out and killed, right? And like much of the rest of the conflict, the United States is very successful in putting down much of the fighting. The ancient city of Hue, which is towards the coast, up towards the northern area of southern Vietnam, this is a Life magazine cover of soldiers fighting to liberate the city of Hue. Hue was an ancient city, particularly the citadel in the center of the city, and this battle lasted for almost a month, about 3 weeks, and it was a particularly hard-fought battle. It was widely covered, and you had images like this front cover image of Life magazine showing American soldiers fighting a really, really grueling and gritty battle over the city of Hue. American journalists like the famous Walter Cronkite made statements like, "I thought we were winning the war." It shocked the media as much as it shocked the American public. Suddenly we went from a situation where the military leadership was saying, hey, we're about ready to win this war, to we had no idea that the enemy had the ability to operate on this scale. And it's all covered by journalists. They're all presenting this as coming back home. And in some cases, journalists present it as a defeat and never really changed that story, though the shock had less to do with journalism and more to do with the policy of the United States up to that point. Perhaps one of the most controversial and symbolic statements from this moment was surrounding the village of Binh Tri, in which an American officer there was interviewed and talking about this operation and responded to a question, and he said, "We had to destroy the village to save it." What does a statement like that tell you? We talked about, the usage of, population, moving populations and the usage of village destruction in our last class. What does that kind of a statement tell you about the kind of war that the United States is involved in here? Thomas.
It's a very gray area. Like, you couldn't really tell who the enemy was, be that farmers or people, because a lot of times Viet Cong would be dressed as civilians.
It's a war that blurs the lines between village and civilian, right? And oftentimes Viet Cong activity was intertwined with villages, right? And in certain cases, this meant that whole villages had to be destroyed in order to, if you will, win or save the village in this case. And you have to ask yourself, the overarching goal during the war was to win the hearts and minds. And you have to ask yourself, can you win the hearts and minds when this is how policy actually, shapes itself in the war? So it's a very shocking event. The ramifications of this are going to be huge. Now, if you're a military guy, this is Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford with Lyndon Johnson. If you are William Westmoreland, the general who oversees the operations in Vietnam, the American military operated very effectively. The Viet Cong were pretty resoundingly defeated ultimately. If you were a military guy, what would you say the next step should be? Go on the offense, right? Nick? Go on the offense. And that's exactly what the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Earl Wheeler and General William Westmoreland suggest. They provide a new proposal. It's called Operation Duckhook. Note, there's almost 500,000 troops in Vietnam at this point. We've had a gradual escalation. Remember, you're pursuing that breaking point, and so America went from a handful of advisors to 100,000, then 200,000, ultimately 500,000 troops in less than, a period of 6-7 years, if you go back to the period of advisors under Kennedy. We gradually escalated the number, with the whole idea being that more and more force, higher and higher kill counts, more bombing will result in a breaking point and getting the enemy to come to the table for peace negotiations. Earl Wheeler and General William Westmoreland suggest 206,000 more troops take more aggressive offensive actions in areas of infiltration, Cambodia, Laos, and into North Vietnam. Hit them while they're down, so to speak. Go on the counteroffensive. Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford meets with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the American military. And given the fact that you're talking about a proposal that will take American forces from 500,000 to 700,000, roughly speaking, what do you think Clark Clifford, the new Secretary of Defense, what do you think his first question might be? If you're going to send this many more troops in there, what might you like to know? Octavio?
What's going on in this war?
So he said, what's going on in this war?
Yeah,
What's our policy?
well, why can't we win?
Why can't we win? That's actually, where you're going with your gut there is right on point.
Yeah.
Okay? Clark Clifford goes there and he says, okay, you guys want 200,000 more troops. Well, do we have a policy that can ensure that 200,000 more troops will result in success? He wants to know, do we have a policy to win? Because up to this point, the United States policy to win was reliant on attrition. It was reliant on going in there, dropping a lot of bombs to try to cut infiltration routes, and to try to exact really high kill counts on the enemy, hoping that eventually that level of destruction would bring them to the table to negotiate, right? So he asked him that very question, and he comes back, and this is what Clifford recommends. Clifford asked him, he says, is 200,000 enough troops? And he said, this is paraphrasing him. He said, well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, we don't know. Are you sure that this can result in a victory? How long will it take? We don't know. Ultimately, Clark Clifford comes back from his meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and basically recognizes that they don't really have a policy to win in the war. It's basically more of the same, just expanding the operations a little bit. And as a result of that, Clark Clifford and Johnson, now think about this. Thomas, you've been kind of talking about Johnson as the low complexity thinker, the political science term we've talked about. Johnson likes people who are loyal to him, and you can imagine how he feels with this, because he appointed Clark Clifford, this guy right here, to the Secretary of Defense to replace Robert McNamara, and his feeling was Clark Clifford was his guy. And now his guy has just started his term in office. He goes and meets the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he comes back to Johnson and he says, quote, "This one's a real loser. We should probably try to get out." How do you think Johnson felt about that? Thomas said, I can't even imagine what was going through Johnson's head. And you're right. This is a horrible shock to Lyndon Johnson. And, you know, it should be said that Lyndon Johnson did not want to fight a war like this. He wanted to do his domestic society programs. He did not want to be involved in this type of a conflict. He carried a tremendous amount of personal weight for people that were fighting and dying in Vietnam. But once he took the course, he wanted people to try to give him answers to how they might succeed. And having this report from Clark Clifford was very difficult for the president. As a result of this, Lyndon Johnson calls for a bombing halt. After Clifford gives him this word, he calls for a bombing halt. And in one of the most famous speeches in American presidential history, the end of March 1968, Johnson goes before the cameras and tells the American people that he will not run for president for another term. It's an election year. It's 1968. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. He says, "I will not accept the nominee of my party for another term as president of the United States." It wasn't a resignation, but it was almost that. He's going to focus on what they're doing now, and then his time is up. It's kind of taken him to the end here, if you will. The Tet Offensive, and going back to Cody's, your thought that if you wanted to sell this war in 1967, when you have major events like the Stop the Draft Week protest, you go out there, if you think you're winning, you go out there and you tell the American people, we're winning. We're actually being more successful than maybe people that are protesting the war think, right? The Tet Offensive is like a psychological shock. Despite the fact that the military was incredibly successful on the battlefield, it shocked the country. People ultimately wondered how much was it going to take to win this war? Was it worth the amount of time, the amount of effort, the amount of money it might take to win the war? Long story short, we see the confidence in the war effort really plummet as a result of this. And the United States makes a decision after Tet, and this is regardless of whether it was a Democrat or a Republican, and of course the next president would be a Republican, Richard Nixon. The United States makes a decision to begin a process of getting out of Vietnam because of the overwhelming shock caused by the Tet Offensive. Troop numbers were at a peak of around 500,000. This is another image down here that you see, which is really, symbolic of the shock of the Tet Offensive. This is a police chief in Saigon, the capital city of South Vietnam. Today it is called Ho Chi Minh City. And this is a Viet Cong guerrilla that had went into his residence, and he dragged him out in the street, and he executed him by shooting him in the head at point blank range. That video, not just the picture, was broadcast all over the television in the United States. And you might say, well, this was a Viet Cong guerrilla who went into the man's home, but you go from the light at the end of the tunnel to Saigon police chief fighting in the streets, executing guerrillas on TV, basically. The Saigon embassy being attacked. Like battles like the Battle of Khe Sanh that were like shocking in their destruction. Really shocked Americans. There are moments where the United States at this point thinks they might have an opening to peace. Henry Kissinger, who is right here celebrating his Time magazine Man of the Year award, later when he's with Nixon, when he's in the National Security Council, when he's going on to become Secretary of State, Kissinger was lined up for a position in Richard Nixon's administration. And there were peace talks that were opened up at this time, but it's an election year, and Kissinger meddled in the election process. We know this now. He kind of went through back channels and encouraged the the South Vietnamese to not negotiate, to delay, because if they didn't, if they negotiated at the time, they might not get as good a deal than they would get if Nixon was president. And so you had some back-channel meddling in the peace process at this time. The war after Tet, and I'll kind of move through this, and I want to talk about American society a little bit. The war after Tet changes. Instead of being the large-scale sort of search and destroy types of operations, it becomes centered around small patrols and limited engagement. Overseen now, William Westmoreland was out, overseen now by General Creighton Abrams, who you see pictured here. American policy, too, centered on something called Vietnamisation, and that was a term that was meant to refer to the turning over of the war to the Vietnamese. The United States did not want to lose South Vietnam to communism, but they also believed that sustaining the war as a direct American effort was not going to work. Americans had grown tired of this. It was also strapping the economy quite a bit. And so the United States began to push for turning the war over to the Vietnamese. This was called Vietnamisation. Turn the war over to the Vietnamese. They built up an army, 800,000-man army in South Vietnam, top 10 air force in the world, high-tech military, but desertions were at an all-time high. What does that fact tell you? What's the root of the problem here? There's no popular support, Nick. There's no popular support behind the South Vietnamese government. The whole problem, even if you went back to John F. Kennedy's administration when the leader was Ngo Dinh Diem, the whole problem with much of American policy there is we could not support or find a leader in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, that was capable of building and garnering true national support. And so you have a situation where you have the Viet Cong guerrilla who can operate with incredible, meager supplies, a few rounds of ammunition, maybe a little satchel of rice, right? Some sandals made out of old tires. And they could operate in the face of overwhelming odds. You have the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, that is an army of like 800,000 soldiers, top 10 air force in the world, high tech, American supported. Desertions are at an all-time high. And so that really signified a problem when it came to turning the war over to the Vietnamese, because there was not yet an effective nationalist groundswell in the South. It was highly questionable whether or not it would be capable of succeeding on its own. And of course, long term, that's what played out, the collapse of Saigon in 1975. The United States also tried to pursue success in Vietnam with a highly controversial program that was overseen by this individual here, William Colby, who was in the CIA, and he would later become the director of the CIA in 1973. And the Phoenix program was part of an operation that you would call pacification, pacify the countryside. But what it really boiled down to was an assassination program. The idea was you have this real problem. Guerrillas operating in the countryside, right? That's the problem. They operate in and around villages. They're very difficult to target. You can't identify them. There's the line between combatant and civilian is blurred, right? And so in this post-Tet era, the United States moves towards these types of programs, turning over the war to the Vietnamese, smaller American patrols, and the usage of what was effectively a CIA-organized assassination program. Now, that assassination program was highly problematic, and I'm going to talk about that just in a moment, but I want to throw a few facts up here for you, because some of these might surprise you. Despite Johnson calling a bombing halt, 1968 was actually the most destructive year of the war thus far. The bombing escalated. 3 times the amount of bombs dropped in 1967 were dropped in 1968. Over 1 million tons. The war became, in many respects, more destructive and more brutal. Some 4,000 Americans died, maybe 43,000 of the enemy died in 68. And so the question is, how can this be? I thought Johnson was, thinking about negotiations. I thought Johnson stopped the bombing campaign. The reason that this was like this is because the United States stopped bombing areas in the north. They stopped bombing military installations in the southern areas of North Vietnam, but they escalated the bombing campaigns that were targeting infiltration routes. They escalated bombing campaigns that were in support of U.S. operations. And so it was really a testimony of just how destructive the war became in 1968. And it's also part and parcel to now that the new goal in Vietnam, the new goal, centers on trying to pacify the countryside. And so the war, in many respects, despite the fact that the United States is beginning to pull away from Vietnam, in many respects, you actually see aspects of the war become more destructive after Tet. Pacification under the Phoenix program was basically a program to secure the countryside by eliminating Viet Cong guerrilla activity. What does that mean? If you have guerrillas that are very difficult to differentiate between regular villagers, what does that mean for the American war? Are there any issues there? What do you think, guys? Yeah, so if our new goal through pacification, the Phoenix program, is to eliminate the VC from the countryside, eliminate the guerrilla threat from the countryside, right? But you have a situation where the guerrillas live in and around the villages. They rely on the villages. They are villagers, right? The line between civilian and combatant is blurred. So if you're going out into the countryside to eliminate the VC, the Viet Cong, through a program of assassination within the villages, what's probably going to happen? Porfirio. What kind of casualties? Civilian casualties. Yeah. The Phoenix program was sometimes described as like a mobster going into a bar to kill one person and sort of opening up on the whole bar. There were some individuals associated with this program that described it this way. There were some 20,000 people eliminated as a result of this program. And much of the testimony about the way this program worked came from the actual words of William Colby, the guy from the CIA, who testified before Congress about this operation. There's more free fire zones. Remember, we talked about the My Lai massacre last class. That was an example of the ramifications of a free fire zone operation. You're bombing VC strongholds more heavily. And ultimately, it decimates the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are absolutely decimated, but the consequences are an increase in the likelihood of non-combatants being killed. So in some respects, My Lai, of course, the My Lai massacre occurred during the latter stages of the Tet Offensive in 1968. That, of course, is the worst of the atrocities of the Vietnam War. But the fact that the war, civilian and combatant were blurred during this war, that doesn't go away. And in some respects, the Phoenix program was undoubtedly, not that it was ineffective, it was effective in eliminating the Viet Cong, but the consequences were undoubtedly many non-combatant casualties. I want to roll through a couple of these slides kind of quickly. While all this was happening in 1968, because I want to talk about American society a bit, but while this is all happening in 1968, there were like two factions in the Johnson administration. You had the faction led by Secretary of State Dean Rusk down here, and the Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford here with Johnson. And the basic difference was one side, the Dean Rusk faction, said we need to be more aggressive, we need to try to get a peace agreement that's in our interest and the interest of South Vietnam. And the other side, Clark Clifford, was under the understanding that this was a real loser and that the United States basically needed to begin turning the war over to the Vietnamese and begin pulling away from this conflict with or without the South. And so the Johnson administration was to a large degree almost paralyzed as all this is happening after Tet. They're kind of paralyzed during this election year. Makes sense? You guys with me here? U.S. society in 1968, George Herring, the historian, in his book, America's Longest War referred to 1968 as a year of anguish. It's an incredibly tumultuous year in American history. Martin Luther King is assassinated by James Earl Ray, the white supremacist. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, and Bobby Kennedy was a promising candidate for the Democratic nominee for president who was running a campaign on the basis of getting the United States out of Vietnam. It was really an anti-war platform to a large extent. There's also an economic crisis that is occurring in the United States at this time. Vietnam and the policies of Lyndon Johnson had really hurt the country. The post-World War II boom, if you will, the economic boom, really ended in 1968. And a lot of that had to do with the cost of the war, coupled with Johnson's domestic spending programs, and a failure to increase taxes. So remember, Johnson never thought the Vietnam War was going to be a war that lasted, as long as it did. He never thought it would be a war where the United States dropped more bombs in terms of tonnage than all theaters in World War II. He never thought it was going to be a war where 60,000 Americans were killed. He thought you'd get involved, you'd flex your muscles, you'd drop some bombs, you'd show them you mean business, and they would negotiate. Johnson was a wheeler and a dealer. He was a guy who struck compromises. He thought everybody had a bargaining point, right? A bargaining price, right? And so as a result of that, Johnson sort of was kicking the can when it came to the economics of this whole thing, finding sort of sleight of hand ways of dealing with the spending issues. And as a result of this, he really did not want to raise taxes on Americans. But the Great Society programs were costing a lot with Medicare and Medicaid, and the war was costing a massive amount, $3.6 billion a year. The inability to raise taxes, Johnson's reluctance to do this, his inability to do this with Congress as well, results in the beginning of an economic downturn for the United States that really takes hold, and there's other factors in this, but really takes hold in the 1970s as well. But a lot of this had to do with the policies surrounding Vietnam. The election of 1968, here in this image you see Richard Nixon at the top, Hubert Humphrey. Below him, Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. The election of 1968 pitted Republican Richard Nixon, as well as kind of far-right conservative guys like George Wallace and his running mate Curtis LeMay. And I put some of these quotes up there to give you a feel for the kind of radical position of George Wallace. George Wallace, of course, was the governor of Alabama, infamous for the stand in the schoolhouse door during his opposition to desegregation during the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. He made these quotes. President John Kennedy wants us to surrender the state to Martin Luther King and his group of pro-communists who have instituted these demonstrations. In 1968, he said the only four-letter word that hippies did not know was work and soap. George Wallace was a radical. However, and this speaks to just how controversial civil rights was for certain aspects of the country, George Wallace actually carried 5 states across the Deep South in this presidential election. But the election largely pitted Richard Nixon against Hubert Humphrey and some other sort of peace candidates of the Democrats, Eugene McCarthy, and particularly Bobby Kennedy. When Eugene McCarthy was not really ever going to get the nomination. Bobby Kennedy might have really vied for Hubert Humphrey's nomination at the Democratic National Convention. But when Bobby Kennedy's assassinated, it really sets the stage for Hubert Humphrey to be the nominee up against Richard Nixon. And the thing that probably more than anything else sealed the deal for Richard Nixon occurred at the Democratic National Convention of 1968. This really, probably more than anything else, was a critical factor in the election of Richard Nixon over Hubert Humphrey. The Democrats held their convention. Back then, you used to really nominate presidents at the convention, by the way. Today, you go to the convention and you kind of already know who the nominee is. Back then, the convention, they really chose nominees at the convention back then. And of course, the Democrats under LBJ were associated with Vietnam. Like the protesters of the New Left, as they were called, did not like the status quo Democrat. And so anti-war movements, seeing the Democrats as the Vietnam War party, prepared major demonstrations. The mayor of Chicago, Mayor William Daley, Mayor Daley basically says no protester is going to come anywhere close to the convention center. And what actually happens is what historians have sometimes called a police riot. Protesters attempt to march on the convention center, and the police are called in, and situations like this ensued, with people being hit with billy clubs, thrown in the back of paddy wagons. It was really what historians have called a police riot, where the authority figures kind of, seemed to go crazy. But everybody saw this all over the news. This was really bad press for the Democrats, Nixon wins partially, I have another aspect to tell you about here, partially because he has a plan for peace, he says. He doesn't ever tell anybody. He says he has a plan for peace that the so-called silent majority can accept, but he doesn't divulge further. He wishes to obtain peace with honor, is what he says. Now, have any of you ever heard of the silent majority? You ever heard of that term used? Does anybody have a guess who Nixon was referring to in the silent majority? Who was the silent majority? Thomas.
I'm just going to take a swing at it and say that it might be people on the radical right.
So, Tyson said people on the radical right. Actually not as much. Remember, the implication is that it's a majority. It's a silent majority. So there might have been people that were voting for Nixon who were on the radical right? But who do you think he refers to with the silent majority? Who's he talking about? Yeah, Corbin.
The rich.
Not as much the rich. Cody.
People for the war?
Not as much, because Nixon says, I'm going to attain peace with honor. Nixon is saying, I'm going to attain peace with honor. He does, in some respects, prolong the war. Anybody else want to take a shot? Alexis. No, not so much. It's actually middle-of-the-road conservatives, evangelicals, and moderates. To make a long story short on that, you're talking about here the birth of the modern conservative movement. And it's sort of catalyzed around a number of issues. One issue is what was seen as the ugliness of the anti-war movement and the counterculture. So a lot of these folks were looking at kids protesting in the streets. They were looking at hippies and counterculture, and they saw that as, they were very turned off by that. Right? Some of a reaction to the image of that. There's also elements of this movement. This is the birth of the modern conservative movement. There's also elements of this that are really building on a number of really controversial Supreme Court rulings in the 60s. Controversial for some people at the time. The Supreme Court decision that resulted in Miranda rights. Right? Hopefully none of you have ever had your Miranda rights read. But Miranda rights, Nixon is running, his platform is being based on the idea of law and order. We need law and order. We need to get the rioting people off the streets. We need to get things under control. We need to find peace with honor in Vietnam. But he argues that he's a law and order president. That's what his election is about. The Miranda decision in the 60s, that mandated that your rights be read, if you're being arrested, some conservatives saw as making it more difficult for law enforcement to do their job. It was sometimes seen as a decision that wasn't in the best interest of American law enforcement. Sexual privacy and also reproductive rights decisions. If you go to the early 1970s, the issue of Roe v. Wade and abortion, the issue of illegal abortions as a problem in America was a huge part of the feminist movement in the 1960s. A lot of conservatives were reacting to these types of things. Prayer in schools, which was outlawed by the Supreme Court. And even civil rights, which many individuals in the conservative movement saw as an overreach by the federal government and its power. And the Civil Rights Act of 64, these were pretty controversial changes in the United States. And so these things really created, a critical mass, along with the sort of what was seen as the ugliness of the counterculture and the anti-war movement. It created kind of critical mass for a conservative reaction. And here you see Ronald and Nancy Reagan during the time roundabout when Ronald Reagan was governor of California. And the conservative reaction is really a strict constructionist reaction to the Constitution. Limited interpretation of the Constitution as opposed to interpreting it more loosely, right? It was very anti-statist, tended to, meaning anti-federal power. It tended to emphasize states' rights, right? It was intensely anti-communistic. And so this is about, the development of the conservative movement. Is that significant? Yeah, it's really significant. The modern conservative movement, in terms of its influence on federal policy, really more than anything else, it's emerging in the 60s. It's emerging with support for first Barry Goldwater in 64 and then Nixon in 68. But it really comes to a full circle with the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980. And if you think about history in broad kind of views, from the 30s until the 70s, this was the era of New Deal liberalism. Remember in class, we did a class activity on FDR and the New Deal. New Deal liberalism, which was based on the idea that the federal government can take certain actions to reform and regulate the system that are ultimately better for people, right? And so the new era of New Deal liberalism brought you things like, and neither of these are perfect, but it brought you things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and minimum wages, the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, these types of programs. And the era of the modern conservative movement, which has really embodied the period from the election of Reagan to present, this period is generally associated with an emphasis on greater states' rights, an emphasis on lowering taxes, these types of approaches. So it's a very, very significant development in American history. We're living in an era. This is still the era of this is the conservative era in terms of American politics. Nixon's plan for Vietnam. We're almost done, just a few more slides. Nixon becomes president. And how's Nixon going to succeed in Vietnam? What do you think? How do you think Nixon is going to solve the problems of Vietnam? Do you think he's just going to pull out, Julian? You think he's going to pull out? Nixon's definitely not going to pull out. What do you think Nixon's going to do?
He announced a new policy.
He does announce a new approach, yes, more or less. He doesn't really ever formally announce it, but there's a myriad of things he does that are part of this policy. He's not going to just get out of Vietnam. He wants peace with honor. He does not want South Vietnam to fall to communism. What do you think he's going to do? He's going to be more aggressive in Vietnam. And particularly, the main issue in Vietnam was infiltration points from Laos and Cambodia. So he's going to bomb in a more unregulated fashion, and he's going to enter into border areas of Cambodia and Laos. It's, in a lot of respects, it's more of the same. Because with the exception of expanding the war here, Henry Kissinger was quoted as saying any fourth-rate nation's got to have a breaking point. They're still looking for the breaking point. So you're expanding the war, intensifying the bombing in certain areas, particularly in North Vietnam. The most notable of that was the so-called Christmas bombing of 1972, to try to bomb the North Vietnamese into signing a peace treaty that is in the best interest of the United States and South Vietnam. What made the plan possible? What was Johnson afraid of? During the limited war of Lyndon Johnson, why did he not make an aggressive war in North Vietnam? What was his primary motivation in the war being limited? What was he afraid of? Well, he's afraid of communists taking over in the South, Cody, but he's afraid of something more than that. If he was only afraid of that, he might have been more aggressive. Julian?
Losing the support of the Vietnamese?
Not as much. Not as much. I mean, he's concerned with that, but I'm thinking big scale. Why doesn't he bomb Haiphong Harbor in the north?
Well, you have Soviets and Chinese to worry about.
Nixon was really afraid of an over-aggressive action in the North, sparking an international crisis and causing the Soviet Union to get involved, or the Chinese, like in the Korean War, to get involved. He doesn't want it to escalate into an uncontrolled war. Well, Nixon's going to be more aggressive. He is going to bomb around areas of Hanoi, and he's not going to worry as much about the war expanding. And the reason was he makes nice with the Soviets. And he puts the great power diplomacy of the Soviets and the Chinese, he puts that at the front of his initiative. So he creates a relationship with the Soviet premier, Leonid Brezhnev. He pushes through really landmark agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, or SALT I, which was an agreement that was designed to limit nuclear weapons. He put together the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with the Soviet Union. These are all designed to limit nuclear weapons stockpiles and ballistic missile defense systems in the world. These were really, from the Soviet and the United States standpoint, these were huge breakthroughs in the Cold War. These are huge breakthroughs in the Cold War. And it ushered in a period, it's called détente, where the United States and the Soviet Union were really less hostile to each other. The idea was, if you do these types of things, then when Nixon starts bombing Hanoi, he can talk to Brezhnev and say, you know, we're not really worried about that issue, are we? He can kind of take that off the table for them, if you know what I mean. He visited China, goes to China, the opening of the door of China to United States relations. And by the late 70s, China was being recognized by the United States, the government founded by Mao. And so great power diplomacy is what makes this plan possible. Now I have a question for you. Do you think that Nixon's approach, this right here, he launches an invasion of 100,000 people into Cambodia. He bombs Cambodia very heavily. There is later an operation led by the South Vietnamese military, very much failed, Lam Son 719, that went into Laos. He opens up these areas. Cambodia was a neutral country. He opens up these areas to the war. He bombs North Vietnam more heavily, particularly during the Christmas bombing. Do you think it changed the outcome? Do you think the United States got an agreement from North Vietnam and said, you know what, we're willing to acknowledge and recognize the South, we're going to leave them alone? No. It doesn't work. It's actually an expansion of the war, a sort of escalation of bombing up around areas like Hanoi, particularly again with the Christmas bombing, but it doesn't actually change the result. The agreement, the Paris Peace Agreement that was signed at the beginning of 1973, was an agreement that was pretty much more or less what the United States always would have gotten. The North Vietnamese refused to recognize DMZ as a legitimate border. They're allowed to stay in all the occupied areas. And ultimately, when the United States pulls out by 1975, Saigon falls rather quickly in a chaotic event in what was called the Ho Chi Minh Offensive. So it doesn't really change the course of things here. And just a couple more slides. This one and one more. After the Tet Offensive, the Phoenix program, the Viet Cong are totally decimated. The Viet Cong basically ceased to exist. And the U.S. is beginning to withdraw. For the war itself, the war became more conventional. It became a war about the North Vietnamese Army versus the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or the ARVN. And of course, what we know about the ARVN, which of these two militaries do you think is more effective? The North Vietnamese Army is more effective. And without American direct support, it was pretty questionable that they would be able to succeed without the United States. The idea of the general offensive, the guerrilla uprising, the peasant soldier out there, it really goes away after Tet. The Viet Cong were decimated. They were completely decimated. And so it really became a more conventional war. And that had certain ramifications as well for the end of the war. When Saigon fell, it was treated more as a conquest than a liberation in some respects. What about the American soldier? What do you think it was like to fight in Vietnam after the United States had basically openly said that it was withdrawing from Vietnam, that it wasn't there to win in the way that you might typically think. Octavio.
Felt like they're fighting a lost cause.
You're fighting a lost cause. Julian.
Loss of morale.
Yeah, troop morale goes down. Troop morale deteriorates. And instead, American soldiers, as you see with this soldier on his helmet, what is that on his helmet? What's he doing on his helmet? He's counting the days. Soldiers began counting the days. Nobody wants to be the last soldier to die in Vietnam. There's cases that they increase. They're not on a massive, massive scale, but there's more than you'd like to imagine. There's cases of fragging. You know what fragging is? What's fragging, Nick? Yeah, that was the killing of an unpopular officer. So if you have an officer who comes in and says, really gung-ho, let's go do it, and they're very unpopular with the everyday soldier there are certain cases where very unpopular officers were killed by their troops. There's cases of insubordination where officers say, well, the enemy's over there, and a lot of soldiers at that point, post-Tet, they say, the enemy's there, well, we don't need to go there unless we really have to. People don't want to be the last person to die in Vietnam. Troop morale deteriorates significantly. There are also issues with drug usage. And certain elements of the military said at times there was an epidemic of drug use amongst troops. And some of the drugs could be very serious ones like heroin, opium, and morphine, which were widely available in South Vietnam. And the last slide, the 1960s, is also the end of the sort of counterculture 60s movement. This gives way. Now, this is Woodstock, of course. In 1969, the Woodstock Festival, which was a festival organized around, the idea of anti-war and counterculture. And with the end of the 60s, you see the old sort of anti-war movement kind of dwindle away. There were still very significant protests. The protests to the Cambodian incursion in 1970, of course, resulted in the Kent State shootings and other events as protests across campuses across the United States became very significant. You also had American veterans, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, led by individuals like former Secretary of State and presidential candidate John Kerry. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War staged some of their most publicized protest movements in the early 1970s. So this is not to suggest that the anti-war movement goes away, only that the counterculture movement of the 60s, this idea of sort of attempting to redefine what it meant to be a citizen, attempting to redefine society, and this kind of centering around the Vietnam War in a lot of respects sort of begins to dwindle away after the 60s, after the Woodstock Festival, which of course featured some of the most famous artists of their time. Groups like The Band, which is one of my favorite groups. They used to be Bob Dylan's backing band. Janis Joplin, of course Jimi Hendrix, who played on the unannounced fourth day. They didn't even give him a legitimate day. So if you ever watch Jimi Hendrix playing the Star-Spangled Banner, right, which is that might be the most iconic song of the whole counterculture period. And it actually occurred on an unofficial fourth day at Woodstock because they had terrible rain, the conditions were horrible, people didn't have enough food and water, the sound system was apparently terrible, it rained a lot. But it was a symbolic event for members of the American counterculture movement. But as a mass movement, you really begin to see it give way into the 1970s. Octavio.
Noticing a lot of trash that no one's picking up.
Well, right. It's a big music festival, and you could say it's a big mess too. Yeah. And of course, the image, this type of image of the counterculture. At Woodstock, nakedness, drugs, these types of things. This was one of the things that really mobilized people that jumped into what Nixon called the silent majority and joined the sort of conservative movement, right? So this is 50 years since 1968, and we kind of carried this through 68, the election of Nixon, and we talked a little bit about longer term things. But 1968 was a really critical moment in American history. It was the moment in which there was a fundamental political shift in the United States. It was a moment in which the American economy got set up for a downturn in the 1970s. It was a time in which the United States' war in Vietnam kind of reached a critical mass when it came to the will of the American people, to deal with this conflict. And it led to the United States begin to withdraw slowly from Vietnam, though the war wasn't over. And of course, in the subsequent years, you would have horrifying events like the Cambodian genocide unfold in Cambodia after the United States pulled support for its ally in Cambodia, and the country descended into a civil war. The end of the war resulted in re-education centers in parts of South Vietnam. There were a significant extent of repression of certain populaces in Laos and Cambodia, of course massively in Cambodia, and in South Vietnam, who had aligned with the United States, or the United States supported government in the South. The United States today still gives monetary aid to Vietnam to try to clear out unexploded ordnances from the area. In fact, according to the government of Vietnam, upwards of maybe 100,000 people have died since the fall of Saigon in 1975 from unexploded ordnance from the period of the Vietnam War and the French Indochina War. Some 20% of the jungle of Vietnam was sprayed with a carcinogenic chemical, Agent Orange, to try to defoliate the countryside, which has had long-lasting effects on the population there. Vietnam has also had a long-lasting effect on veterans who served in that war, not only from post-traumatic stress disorder, but also from the way they were treated upon coming home. The Vietnam veteran was not received the way you might imagine like a World War II veteran to have been received. And they were, in some ways, American society looked away from the Vietnam veteran. And this is a very highly problematic thing, and it has shaped how we look at and think about and treat our veterans today. So this is a really landmark moment in American history, and I want to do this talk on the 50-year anniversary of it. So hopefully it was helpful and pretty clear. All right. You don't have to applaud. All right. Thanks, guys.